Hi, and welcome back. Today, we're going to do some additional pre-processing. We're going to get to do artifact rejection and correction. So moving on, we have done a lot so far. We've filtered the data and we've gone all the way up through epoching it. Now we want to look for where are the errors in our data? Where are the artifacts, the things that we don't want in our data? So artifacts are anything in our data that we don't want, right? So EEG records any and all electrical activity. So that is brain potentials, but it's also muscle potentials, electrocardiograms, skin potentials, some ongoing EEG, electricity from anything in our environment. So our monitors, our cell phones, our lights, things like that. So activity related to things other than the brain are called artifacts. I include alpha in there, although it is from the brain. It is something we might consider an artifact, even though it's from the brain, because it is something we don't want in our data. We care about artifacts because we want to see just the brain activity of interest, and we want to increase the signal and decrease the noise, right? So we want to decrease the signal to noise ratio. We can do some of this through our averaging process because some of this noise is random. And so as we average, that randomness gets averaged out and it attenuates it. But that doesn't do all of it because some of it is systematic or regular. So for example, if we blink our eyes every time we hit a button, that's going to be in sync with our stimulus presentation. It's not going to get averaged out. We also might have things like blinks that happen when the stimulus is on the screen. And that's going to affect whether we actually see what we're supposed to be seeing, and that will affect our brain activity. So we don't want those either. So we care about things that are going to make whatever it is that we're interested in seeing harder to see. So we're going to walk through some of the different ones we'll be concerned about. The first are blinks. Those are some of the biggest and the most prominent. They're the result of the corneal retinal projection, and we call these the vertical electrooculogram, or VEOG. And we're looking at them using electrodes above and below the eye, and they have a very distinct waveform. The upper one will go down, the bottom one will go down, the upper one will go up. And so you have this nice activity that is moving in opposite directions. We also have eye movements from left to right. These are also a result of the corneal retinal projection. And we can look at these through using bipolar HEOG recordings. When we move our eyes, we're doing saccades. We're not actually getting visual data in the system, so we care about those. It affects our sensory input, and they look like little box cars is the way I think about them. So they're recording from both sides of the eye, and what happens is when one side goes down, and the other side goes up. And so we can easily recognize these by that kind of difference in activity in these kind of box shapes that we'll see in our data. You can have to also have slow drift, skin potentials and sweat. When you get hot, it actually impacts the impedance you have, and it will change your data, and there'll be some slow drift. And so that can be something that you care about because it will drift out of range or drift just enough that from trial to trial it's different. It can be due to the subject moving around or your electrolytes drying out, many different reasons. You can also have something called saturation or blocking. This is when the signal goes out of range. This really doesn't happen very often, and it appears as a kind of a flat line, but it is something to be aware of. And that's just simply that the electrical activity has gone out of the range of what the amplifier can actually deal with. As I mentioned before, some artifacts are actually brain activity. You may want to see alpha, but you may not want to see alpha. Alpha happens at about 8 to 10 or 8 to 12 hertz, and it is the result of activity in the back of the brain, the posterior of the brain. And it occurs when you're concentrating or you're tired or you have your eyes closed, right? One way to reduce this is to change the timing between trials, the intertrial intervals. If you jitter them, it may not line up as much with the stimulus, and so that can help average them out. Also, if it's somebody who's tired, you want to try and keep them awake. Just your environment and how you're setting up your experiment is important. There's also muscle and heart activity. So if you're clenching your jaw or your forehead muscles or you're squinting, that's going to create muscle movement that is much higher in frequency. You can also pick up electrocardiogram, or the beating of the heart. Sometimes if an electrode is too close to a really big vessel, you might pick up electrocardiogram activity, and you don't want that as well. And then finally, there are speech-related artifacts. These are things exactly as they sound, related to speech. And that's because they use muscles in speech production. There's an electrical gradient across the tongue. All of these things are going to create artifacts in our data. It's also a limitation. It means that it's difficult to do studies involving language production. There are also other artifacts that kind of don't fall into those main categories. We typically call these CRAP, or commonly recorded artifactual potentials. Some examples of these are things like tapping your foot or bouncing your leg, chewing gum, talking to yourself when you make a mistake. And then one that's really important that I think about a lot is when you tell people don't blink when the stimulus is on the screen, they might be thinking about it too hard, and then they're actually using a lot of eye muscles to not blink, and they may even start twitching. So you have to be careful about what you say to participants about how to kind of do the experiment so they're not creating all these artifacts. You also want to pay close attention to both the EEG and the video feed, because if you're seeing something funny on the EEG, you can look at the video feed, if you have a video feed, to see what they might be doing to create that, and you can take a note of that. There are a number of options for dealing with artifacts. You can try and reduce them, talk to your participant, tell them what not to do. You can also reject them, just exclude contaminated trials, and that's what we're going to do today when we walk through the practical stuff. And then the last one is correction. You can estimate the influence of the artifacts and attempt to reverse the effects. We're not going to be talking about that today. It's a little bit more advanced level, but this is something people do regularly with ICA and things like that. But before we can actually reject trials or even correct for them, we have to detect those artifacts. So I think of this as like a smoke detector. You need to select a threshold value so you don't miss the smoke of a fire, but you also don't want to have the alarm going off every time you burn your toast, right? So we want to have as many hits that we actually are correctly identifying our artifacts, and as many correct rejections saying this is not an artifact as we possibly can, while reducing our false alarms and our misses. So we're trying to kind of balance those when we set a threshold. There are a number of methods. We're going to be doing the practicalities of the simple and moving window peak to peak, but I'm going to show you what a step function can do for you as well. So first, simple voltage threshold is exactly as it sounds. It sets an upper and lower threshold and marks any trial that exceeds that threshold. It's useful for detecting blinks, but it's not super useful for other artifacts. And part of this is because it's impacted by your baseline correction. And so you want to make sure you're using your baseline correction before you do this, because if you have baseline corrected, you might catch a blink. But if you haven't baseline corrected, the activity might not actually fall in your window of your threshold. So you might miss it, or you might even have a false alarm because the data is too close to your threshold. So you definitely want to make sure you baseline correct if you are using this methodology, but it can be good for picking up those blinks. A second method is something we call the moving window peak to peak. This is defining a window width and step and a voltage threshold. And it basically measures the difference between each peak, between the highest peak and the lowest peak within a window. And then that window moves over time. So you have a window and it's kind of moving along your trial, and it's saying, okay, is there anything within that range within that window? And so in this case, it's going to catch a blink right there, and then it's going to move on. So it's going to detect blinks regardless of baseline or drift, and it's better for isolating individual artifacts. So in this case, there was a window set for 200 milliseconds with a 75 millivolt threshold, and it's going to catch those blinks that fall within that moving window. So this is a secondary great option for catching those blinks. Finally, there's something called the step function. This is useful for detecting small eye movements, and it uses a moving window to find the difference in mean of amplitude between two regions. So this is good for picking up things like saccades because it's taking an average of each little area, and then it's averaging those and then comparing how far they are apart from each other. So in this case, it's a 200 millisecond step function, and it's going to be checking those. So finally, we want to think about what parameters we're going to be choosing to set our different thresholds and which electrodes we're using, things like that. So the first thing we need to do is decide which electrodes we're actually using for our artifact rejection. You definitely, if you're interested in blinks, are going to want those eye channels, but you might also want to have other channels that are related to your components. So for example, if you're doing a visual experiment, you might want to choose some posterior occipital electrodes to be using. You definitely do not want to use your bad channels. So those are just going to give you lots of artifacts that aren't actually artifacts. You then also need to think about what your voltage thresholds are going to be. Those may be tailored to individual subjects or individual groups. So for example, if you're working with kids, you might have a larger range for kids because they actually have higher amplitude data than you would for adults. And then finally, you want to choose a relevant time window. So are you interested in just when the stimulus was on the screen? Maybe you do something just in that short window. Maybe you're interested in the entire trial, or maybe you're just interested in the first 600 milliseconds of that trial because that's where the activity is that you're interested in. And so you want to think about that, and also things like motor responses and blink breaks. Do you want to have a window that kind of ends before that motor response, right? So those are all decisions you have to make before you actually are going to do your experiment. So moving on, practicalities. All right, so we're going to go back to MATLAB. I'm going to go ahead and quickly pretend I'm starting fresh for the day, and I'm going to go ahead and set my path. I'm going to add with subfolders where my plugins are for EEG Lab, ERP Lab. And again, I'm adding with subfolders. Go ahead and close that if you have to do that. And then I'm going to bring up EEG Lab. Now, in the prior videos, we'd been starting with a raw data file. Today, we're going to start farther down in the stream of processing, just so that we don't have to walk through all of those different steps. So instead of doing our raw data file like we've been doing, I'm going to use load existing data set because I already have a data set. So in this case, I'm going to be using this one. It's subject 1070. It's one that I've labeled as epoched, but that's as far as it's gone. The nice thing is when I open this data set, you'll see that my data set, it's data set number 1. It tells me what the different things I did to it already. So I filtered it, I had an E-list, and I assigned those bins, and I extracted the bin-based epochs. So that's where this stage is at. In the little theory portion, I talked about the automated ways we can look for artifacts. We can also do that by hand. I am going to show you that as well. So how we would do that is we'd go ahead and plot our data using channel data scroll. And what we'll do is we will go through and look at our data. First, you want to set the display size, right? You don't want to do too small or too big. So you want to see your data at a nice range. And then you're going to walk through your entire subject, their data, looking for artifacts, and you'll have to make a decision. So for example, in this particular window, we see that there is a blink here. I know it's a blink because it's a big up and a big down between my FP2, which happens to be above the eye. And if I look at the vertical lower down here, it goes down. If I change the scale real quick, so everything's smaller, you can see they're kind of mirrors of themselves, of each other, right? So that's going to be a blink. I want to mark that. And so I just click on it to mark it and it will turn it yellow. So I know it's marked. Maybe I decide this one's a blink, but you have to do this throughout the entire thing. So you can go second by second, or you can move, several at a time, but you are going to need to go through the whole thing. One thing to note though, is you might decide that actually, I don't care about these blinks. Yes, it's a blink, it's an artifact. But so for example, here's the start of my trial. Here's my stimulus. That's what these numbers are. So this happens to be a stimulus presentation. These ones I happen to know are from a response. And so what I might say is, actually, I have my pre-stimulus window and post-stimulus window, and this blink is occurring after they respond, and I don't actually care about that. So I might, initially say, oh, it's a blink, but then I might decide, I don't actually care. So I'm going to unclick it and unselect it. Once I've gone through and I've decided which are the ones I care about, I'm going to go ahead and hit reject. And it will ask me, do you want to reject the label trials? I'm going to go ahead and say yes. What it's doing is it's marking those trials and saying those are artifacts. When you do this particular kind of rejection, it's going to ask you if you want to save it. I definitely would. Generally, I'm not going to today just for the purposes of this video, but you would want to save this as something on your desktop to have it. No, go ahead and click OK. It creates a second data set. But now I want to do this instead. I want to do this as an automated process. So I'm going to go back one step to my last file, and it's going to ask me to save my last file name because I've just changed what I was doing. And so I'm just going to save it with the name of the last one I did. And I might even say, you know what, this was my first time I artifact it. So I'm just going to give it that artifact 1. So if that pulls up, that I know what I did. And so it's still there. It doesn't have that AR1 on there, but that's just something it has in the system. So if I can look back. So we're now back on our initial data set that has not been artifact rejected. We're going to do it again. This time, we're going to use a simple voltage threshold. So when we do that, we need to set our time window. So for this one, I'm just going to be interested in, say, the period of time when the stimulus was on the screen. I could do that -200 to 200. In this case, I did -150 to 150. Whatever you decide, you can change those numbers to say, this is the window I care about. I could have cared about the entire window. I could have cared about all the way through 800, if that's my epoch window. You then need to set voltage limits. So you might say -100 to 100 or -75 to 75, but you want to decide what those are. I'm going to go back to -75 to 75. And then you have to decide what channels. So to look at what channels you have available, you can click Browse. I have gone ahead and picked my ones that are my I channels, but you might decide to do other ones as well. I'm going to go ahead and repick the ones for the I channels. To select multiple things, just use Control. So FP2 is my upper I. I'm going to use my right and left as well as my lower I as well. And then I'm going to click OK, and that will populate these numbers. You can change these numbers manually as well, but I just tend to use the browse. So it's going to say, what flag do you want to set? That I'm going to say set flag 1 for all of these artifacts. And I'm going to go ahead and click accept. And what you'll notice is in the background, things are happening. And I'll show you that in a second. Let me just save this. Oh, actually, I'm not going to save that. But generally, you could save this to the desktop, but you don't have to. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And as I was starting to say, in the background, your MATLAB is doing things. And one of the things it's doing is it's telling me for these channels that I chose, how many of my trials were accepted and how many were rejected. So I set flag 1, and so that's why these 2 rows have come up. And it tells me for each bin, so each of these different bins that I have assigned, how many trials there are. And you might remember from when we epoch'd, we only had bins 1 and 2. We didn't have any errors, so we didn't have any bin 3 or bin 4, but we had 60 trials in bin 1 and 60 in trial 2. In this case, 100% of those trials were accepted and none were rejected, which suggests that people just didn't blink when the stimulus was on the screen, which is a great thing, right? That's what we would like to have happen. Probably there are some other artifacts in there I care about, so I'm going to show you what would happen if I did a moving window peak to peak instead, and I changed some of those parameters. So I'm going to go back, and it, again, going to ask me to save it because I'm moving away from the data set I was on. And I'm going to mark this with a 2 because it's the second one I did, just so that I know it's the second one. And again, I'm back on, once it finishes, I'm back on data set 1. So now I'm going to do another kind of artifact detection. I'm going to use moving window peak to peak. If I wanted to do both the simple voltage threshold and the moving peak to peak, I would just have used that same data set and I would have used a second flag. But I'm going back just to see the differences. So now again, I need to set a testing period. So the last time it was just the stimulus window. Now I'm going to say I'm interested in the entire epoch from -200 to 800. I'm also going to set a threshold again now of 75. And now this is just the voltage threshold. It knows it's 75 on either end, and actually a total of 75, I should say. And then it has a moving window of 200. You could set this to 100. You could set this to 300. Doesn't, it depends on how long you want that window to be. And the step, how much time is it moving along? And so 100 is generally fine. And then you need to choose your channels again. So I've already chosen my I channels, but you may need to do that. And again, I'm setting this for flag 1. I could set it for a different flag if I'm doing multiple flags. I'm going to go ahead and accept it. And I'm going to go ahead and say, okay. Again, you could save this to your desktop somewhere, and you probably want to, or not necessarily desktop, but wherever you want to save it. I'm not going to do that right now. So in our background now, if we look at our output, before we had 60 trials that were accepted for each. Now we only have 50% that are accepted. So this is the number of trials. This is the percent of trials. So number and percent, right? And it's rejecting 50% of our trials. So people are definitely having artifacts in these trials. It's just that they weren't during the stimulus period and they weren't being caught with that simple voltage detection. They are being caught with our moving window peak to peak. Now, we're going to be talking more about averaging in the next video, but you might want to compare the averages of when you're rejecting with just your hand rejection versus your simple voltage versus your moving window peak to peak to see what those different things are doing. In fact, you often will want to look at what happens after you've rejected trials to see if it makes your data better or worse. And so you would do that using an average. And I'm just going to average this one file just so you know how to do that so that you can look at it. But you would have to go back to whichever data set had the artifacts you wanted to average to look at that particular average. So I'm just going to do that for set 4. You would go to compute averaged ERPs. And it's going to pull up this window. It's going to ask you which data set. So you could manually change the data set here, but we're using data set 4. We're going to exclude epochs marked during artifact detection. That's exactly what we just did. We just marked all those ones we said with the moving window peak to peak are artifacts. And then we're going to go ahead and just use the default parameters on this, go ahead and run. Don't worry about this if you happen to be using different versions. I happen to be using a different version than when this data set was created, so that's fine. and it's moving, it's doing stuff. And now it's going to ask you to create a new ERP set 1. Now, this is a little bit different, and I'm going to call this 1070. I'm going to say moving av. So this is just so I know that this is the one with the moving average peak to peak. You can also save this to your desktop or your computer somewhere by clicking this, browsing, going to the location, and saving it there. I'm not going to do that right now, but I am going to save it within the system. I'm going to click OK. And what's different about this is that now this is an averaged file. It's not going to appear in our data set list. It's going to appear in our ERP sets list because it's now not just a data set, it's an averaged file. So that's something to keep in mind is when you create these averages, you're now creating an ERP set, which is a little bit different. And then the last thing I'm just going to briefly show you is how you would look at this, because this is now an ERP, not an EEG. We're going to look at that using our ERP lab plot tool. So here we're going to plot our ERP waveform. It's going to pull this up. And it's going to ask you a bunch of questions, the most important of which right now to know about are which of the bins are you looking at? You might not want to look at all 4 bins. You might decide I am only interested in, say, 2 in this case. And again, I use Control to select multiple things. You might not want to look at every single channel, every single electrode. So maybe I really only am interested in CPZ and let's see, FZ, maybe FC4 and FC3. Maybe I'm only interested in 4. Go ahead and click OK. And so if I'm only interested in these 4 and these 2 bins, the default is to have 6 rows of electrodes and 6 columns of electrodes, or 5 columns of electrodes, because then you get 30 on the screen. We only have 4, and I don't want to see them that small. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this and just say, make this frame 2 by 2. And that's just how many different boxes do you have on the screen. It will automatically set a range, a Y range, and an X range. Excuse me. The Y range, you may need to change this, particularly if you're showing all 32 or 30 channels or 60 channels or however many you have. If it includes the I channels, those have really big activity sometimes, and it'll automatically set the range so that everything else looks flat. And so you might need to, instead of having an auto Y scale, not the ticks, the scale, you might want to change this. If this looks like something like negative 100 to positive 200, you're not going to be seeing your brain activity. So you want to make sure this is in a range of, somewhere on the order of negative 25 to 25 at the most, so that you can actually see your brain activity. Most of the time, the auto scale is fine, but that's just something to note. If your data looks funny, go look at your scale. So I'm going to go ahead and hit plot. And it's going to pull up my waveforms. And so then I can compare these waveforms to another average where I haven't rejected as many. In this case, this was the one where we rejected a lot of trials. But what about if I hadn't have done so? I could compare those and say, well, which ones look better? And at first, things looking better may not mean much to you, but after you've looked at a lot of these things, it will become more apparent what you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there for today. But next time we come back, we'll talk more about averaging and creating grand averages. Good luck.